We just had a long talk about the bottle bill, so.
Yeah.
Coming off the bat.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sad I missed that.
I'm not, hey, look, don't do it.
We are? Yep, now we are. Okay. Welcome to Senate Education Tuesday, April 18th, 1:17. Crunch time. I know the goal is to get the budget out Friday. We'll see if that happens. Maybe it'll be Saturday, maybe it'll be Tuesday, out of the Appropriations Committee. We sent a draft of our letter, just a draft, for them to have a heads up on some of our thinking last week. They sent back a few things of a couple of witnesses they'd like us to hear from, one of whom is on the screen right now, Advance Vermont. This is an imperfect science, this back and forth with the probes. In my now third year sharing, it's kind of a little give, little take, back and forth questions. Would you guys take a look at this? And so we're going to be doing that today. And I know Health and Welfare is doing it. I know other committees are doing it as well. So let's hear then. We have you here, Tom. Great to see you.
Great to see you.
And I apologize. I know it's been hard to get into this committee, but we're glad you're here with us now. So let's hear your pitch.
Yeah, well, thanks for squeezing me in. And for the record, I'm Tom Cheney, the Executive Director of Advance Vermont. I know that I have not met many of the members on the committee, so I'll do a quick overview of what we do first, perhaps, Mr. Chair, and then talk about those sections.
Sure. And Tom, did you send any a document?
Yes.
You did. Okay, great.
Yeah, I sent one that was to. Are you guys doing it by sections of the workforce bill or sections of the budget? Because it kind of depends on committee which one they're referring it to. But
I was going to do it by sections of the workforce bill.
Yeah. So,
yeah, that
so
works.
section 20 and section 10. I'll talk in that order. So there's one ask for each of those attached or should be uploaded to the site, as well as kind of an overview of some progress made on myfuturevt.org, which I'll talk about as well. So there should be 3 documents, I think, on this point, if I'm right, Hayden. So Advance Vermont is the sole organization in the state really focused on supporting economic growth and workforce development through meeting the state's post-secondary attainment goal that 70% of Vermonters will hold the post-secondary credential value by 2025. As of 2021, which is the year we have most recent data for, we're at about 59% in the state. So 59% of Vermonters have basically a piece of paper after high school. And we think about these as credentials of value. They include degrees, certificates, apprenticeships, licensure, certifications, that sort of thing. And there's a process the state's going through right now to formally define what a credential of value is. So what this means, this 59%, is we need about 36,000 more Vermont residents with credentials by 2025. So to drive progress towards this goal, we weigh in on policy, we facilitate discussions across sectors, we conduct research and maintain a data dashboard for state leaders and policymakers and others. And we work hard to change the narrative around education and training after high school and the essential connection that it plays to the high pay, high demand careers in our state. We launched and maintain My Future VT, as I mentioned. And this is the state's free online career and education resource. We collect and publish information on credential-bearing programs through this project we call the Vermont Credential Transparency Project. And last year in Act 183, Section 39, the legislature charged us to continue this body of work in collaboration with relevant state agencies and partners. Section 20 in the workforce bill this year is a continuation of that language. But just to give you a sense of our philosophy, kind of the way we think about it is that the primary goal to growing and strengthening Vermont's workforce should be to keep them here, right? We certainly need to recruit folks as well, but the first step should be let's keep them here. Let's educate them here in the state. And a first step to do that is to let them know about the current education opportunities. We have to really dispel the myth that's been long perpetuated that there aren't any jobs in the state, or that there's a lack of education and training programs out there to access those jobs. So second, we have to ensure there's a network of folks we call navigators who are equipped to support career and education seekers, whether it be direct service providers like VDOL counselors or higher ability counselors or VSAC counselors, teachers, coaches, employers, family members. And we really have to show them that there's a lot of different pathways here, and it's not just college or bust. So Section 20 in this workforce bill, H484, was language, like I said, from last year that was drafted in collaboration with the Agency of Education and the Department of Labor. We formed a really great relationship working on this with them over the last year, and they do see the value of continuing this work. So what is Section 20 asking us to do? It's raising awareness about the importance of education and training and those pathways. And this is both for the general public and then also for those navigators. So we kind of direct that message in both directions. We work in partnership with state and non-state entities to help kind of make coordinated progress towards the attainment goal. And then we support several state agencies, especially VDOL, AOE, State Workforce Board. And one example of that is working with the Department of Labor in particular to explore how to better coordinate and potentially integrate some of the things we do on My Future VT and in our credential transparency work into the state workflows and systems, including a new system that they're standing up at the Department of Labor. So really quickly, maybe I'll just explain what My Future VT is and what the Credential Transparency Project is. So myfuturevt.org, like I said, it's the state's only free online resource for career and education information. What it does is helps high school students and mid-career workers alike consider careers and compare education and training programs while directing them to the experts who can help them along the way, such as state agencies. With a lot of credit to the state for the support that we've received over the last 2 years, hopefully a third. The site's reached nearly 50,000 users since it was launched a little bit under 2 years ago, which really has beat our expectations.
When you say users, do you mean, are those folks that are clicking on? How many are you really feel as though are engaging in this process?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you that's something we now that we have a solid baseline, we want to continue to explore that answer and get a very deep answer to that. What I can tell you is that we have a lot of repeat users, so that's one indication. Also, we know that they're going to certain parts of the site with quite a bit of frequency. They really are interested in the information around careers, where we have the top 500 careers in the state listed. They're interested in the education and training program database, where they can explore what education offerings there are in the state. They're searching for terms like nurse, computer, and what's the other one that I was looking at today? Teachers, which is relevant to your committee. So when you're looking at the searchers, we have 3 search engines across the site going after or covering our databases. And that's what they're searching for, are those terms. So I think they're looking for relevant information. You can tell that folks are digging in and trying to explore this. What I'll tell you is all of the information we've received from navigators, people who have used this with counselors, is to a person. They say that this is of value to them. So deeper research, more qualitative, quantitative research we want to do to answer that question really fully. But absolutely every indication is that this is a site that's being used meaningfully. Yeah.
If your organization weren't here, what would people be doing?
They would be kind of scattershot. So they would maybe going to the Department of Labor website, the VSAC website. Maybe they heard about this thing called Higher Ability. Maybe they go to the Higher Ability website. They heard about this thing called dual enrollment, and they're not quite sure where to go. Maybe they finally find it on the Agency of Education website. They are searching national databases for careers in the state. There is some out of the Department of Labor that does a little bit of that too, or quite a bit of that as well. But it's kind of scattershot. So there wouldn't be this one location for career and education seekers of any age to go to be able to access this information. And we do this in concert with state agencies to make sure we're amplifying their work, not duplicating their work, and that we're using similar messaging. I just got off a call earlier today with the Department of Labor, Agency of Education, and Workforce Board where we talked about that. So yeah, this this resource wouldn't exist. People would have a much harder time navigating the mountains of information that they really need to consider their education and training and career options.
Okay, and I'm just passing out the language so everyone can see it.
Okay. Great.
Senator Weeks.
So I think actually Senator Campion's point's a good one. If I were a corporate guy, I would buy your company and make it part of my company, and you would advertise, for the larger good of the state. What is there an agency which really has kind of responsibility to, potentially absorb this type of effort?
Around the advertising piece to get it out there.
It's more, you're right.
Well, excuse me. I could talk a little bit about that. The Department of Labor has Vermont Job Link, and you may be familiar with it. And it's a job board and has some other resources. And it's for job seekers in the state and for employers to post their positions. And they're they're actively looking to replace that. So they're in the final contract stages of bringing on a vendor to replace that with a new portfolio or new portal or whatever you want to call it, CRM, CRM. And so they're working on that right now. We're working in collaboration with them to support them. This is a place where they're interested as they build out their new resource about how do we integrate pieces of My Future VT. I haven't talked in detail about the Vermont Credential Transparency Project, but that's basically our effort to catalog every post-secondary credential in the state. Most states, that's done at the state level. That's something that the agency has interest, or the department has interest in taking on over time as they could build that capacity. So to answer your question, the Department of Labor is kind of the closest intersection point in terms of the state agencies, and we work really closely with them. And part of this language actually asks us to explore how we integrate these things that we've done into their work and explore what aspects they take on versus what aspects we continue to do over time. And to your point about employers, one of the pieces that we want to continue to do is to make more employer connections on My Future VT so that folks can see direct connections to that. So they may be on a career page and they're looking at a career, and they can see that there's a variety of employers in that career in Vermont.
Questions? Yeah, please.
Just curious, again, just kind of catching up here. So this continues work pursuant to XYZ. Was that federal money, state money, or was it even money? Or was it just kind of, support in a bill as opposed to concrete effort?
So we stood this up with some grant dollars. That's what spurred this work. And then we've been getting a combination of grant dollars and state funding over the last 2 fiscal years. And those have been general fund dollars over the last 2 years.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Any questions for Tom?
And
Comments?
there's,
Please. Yeah.
I would just say there's one other provision I just want to flag for you in the bill that's of relevance. But so this one, just to conclude, I think one thing just to note, if you're on the site on myfuturevt.org and you say, well, there's 400 credential programs published. We started with a small group. There's upwards to 1,000 or more credential programs available in the state. We have 400 now. What continued investment will allow us to continue to get that all of the rest of the credential information up on the site and be able to share that. It's not just for users, but it's also to inform policy decisions too. When you're thinking about, we have to invest in this sector or that sector, do we have the education and training programs available? So that's we consider it a real data set as well. But over the course of the next couple months, we're going to go from 400 to 800 credentials in the site. So we're nearing in. We'll have the vast majority of post-secondary credentials available on the site in just a couple months, which is pretty exciting. So I just want to flag that. So the next section is section 10, and this appropriates $100,000 to us to create a climate workforce-focused career and education resources on My Future VT. This is what you'll see on the site is the full proposal that was presented by Energy Action Network's Climate Workforce Action Team. That's a long acronym if you put it together. Over the past year and a half, this action team from the Energy Action Network has convened training partners, employers, working Vermonters, prospective employees, climate and energy organizations, really just to think about how they could develop strategies to address workforce needs in the climate-focused occupations. And a theme that just kept coming back up for them was a lack of understanding of all the professions. So they asked us if we would go in on a proposal with them to create greater awareness around climate careers in the state so that we can meet our climate goals that we have as a state. And it requires building quite a large workforce to do it. So that's what section 10 is. And really it was, the proposal was much larger and was kind of whittled down to this $100,000 to create some more awareness about climate careers on My Future VT. So, and we would be partnering with, with employers and the energy and environmental community to help get the word out of those resources.
Would you be partnering with Al Shapiro on this, or is that a different?
I don't know. Can you remind me who Al is, Senator?
Yeah, that's okay. If you don't know who he is, you're not partnering with him.
Okay. I may know the organization, but it may be that the Energy Action Network is. I'm just not plugged into the whole network. Yeah. Yeah. So that's all I have. Yeah.
Two buckets.
2 buckets of money.
Yeah. And like I said, the second bucket of money is in collaboration with the Energy Action Network, Climate Workforce Action Team, and the other bucket of money is really a continuation of work that we've been doing with the state, and that the state agencies see value in continuing.
I think Al Shapiro is involved with this climate workforce, and we're going to hear from him later in the week as well.
Okay, that may well be, yeah.
I'm going to set these aside. Anything else from you, Tom?
I don't think so. I'm happy to answer any questions. I think the only thing
next year, when we have maybe a little bit more time, you would make a note to yourself. It would be great to hear directly from some people that use this site, who have really made, it's really, I mean, I appreciate everything you're saying, and I'm sure it's making a difference. But in the future, I think for next year, just be great to hear from some individuals.
Yeah, that's right. It's been on our radar, and wasn't something we were able to pull together before this. I will say that when I've been thinking about what our budget looks like next year as an organization, and I've set aside some dollars to try to do something more formally, as well as something informally too that we could bring to you. So absolutely, that's a commitment we can make. Yeah.
Thank you. And we'll have a conversation about all of these later today, but I'll set those two aside, not seeing any questions. Okay. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you so much. Good luck. Be well.
You too. Mr. Leonard, will you join us at the table, please? And I think, how nice to see you here.
Nice to see you too.
How are you?
Can I come?
Good. So you guys you're both here for the same reason.
Yeah, we're just listening.
Great, listening. Mr. Leonard, welcome to Senate Education. We're looking at H 461, an act relating to miscellaneous changes. And Ms. Yang brought before us some language, which is in our folders. This is draft language to amend education harassment statutes.
Right, that's actually, I drafted that language.
Right.
But it's language that I had worked on with board in relation to
Ms. Young's approval.
yes, in relation to a House bill introduced by Representative Christie. So.
And why don't you then take us through it, and then we have Amanda and Board here with us in case they want to weigh in. We were thinking about attaching it to our miscellaneous education bill. And unless you see a concern with that, we would probably do that. But we can always talk to Ms. St. James about this. Sure.
Great. Thank you. For the record, Damian Leonard, Legislative Counsel.
Committee language is right in your folder.
So if you take a look at the language beginning on page 1 and subdivision 26A.
Before you do that,
Yep.
pretend we're in an elevator and we're just going one floor.
Right.
What does this do?
So what this does,
2 floors.
what this does is it changes the standard for showing that you've been discriminated against, or in this case, harassed in an educational setting as a student, from the current standard where you have to show that the discriminatory harassment met a severe or pervasive standard, to just showing that you have been subject to discriminatory harassment. So that's really what we're getting at here, is if you're requiring someone to show that they've been subjected to discriminatory harassment, what do they have to show to meet that requirement?
Any questions on that before we move forward? Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah. So in doing that in subdivision 26A, this is something that Laura testified to last week when she was in front of the committee. The first piece here is we've defined harassment under current law to mean that it's something that has the purpose or effect of objectively and substantially undermining or detracting from or interfering with a student's educational performance or access to school resources, or creating an objectively intimidating, hostile, or offensive environment. The first part of that sentence, substantially undermining and detracting from or interfering, and then with the student's educational performance, means that you have to show a substantial impact on the student's educational performance, not just their education. So in other words, if the student maintains their A- average, you have an argument that there wasn't a substantial impact on their educational performance. So what this would do is would say, change that to just undermining and detracting from or interfering with the student's education.
Right.
So that's just changing what we're looking at there. Is it interfering with their education?
Their
Or is it-
experience in the classroom, whether or not they're comfortable going into the classroom. All
Right.
those kinds of things. Okay.
Right. It's the experience with getting the education versus their ability to perform at school.
Okay.
So that's the first change here.
And Mr. Leonard, is this new territory in the United States, or are we kind of following suit with other states, or?
So this is relatively new territory. New York State and the District of Columbia have adopted this in some of their anti-discrimination laws, and you'll have to forgive me, my experience is primarily in the employment sector, so I can't speak as much to the educational harassment. And then California and one other state, I believe it's Delaware, but Laura would know better. Laura is indicating that I'm correct, it is Delaware, have made changes without specifically addressing the severe or pervasive standard, or specifically repealing that standard. They've made changes in the law to say we want the law to be applied this way. And then New York City, more than a decade ago, they didn't explicitly reference the severe or pervasive standard, but what they said is we want our human rights law to be applied in the broadest possible manner, regardless of what the existing precedent is. And so the New York State courts, when they looked at that, they said what they're saying here is we're not going to severe or pervasive, we're going to was there discrimination. Okay. And so that's probably the oldest example I'm aware of.
Yeah, please.
I just personally have to say, I think tying harassment manifestation to educational performance is, to me, so bizarre. I just have to say it. I mean, having observed children as a teacher for so long time, every person could potentially deal with harm in such a different way. And I can totally see some people becoming hyper-focused on performance and studying. So I just want to say I'm in support of this. It seems to make sense to me.
Yeah, I really like you said that. You've been in the classroom more than anybody here for sure. And I agree. See where some people become hyper-focused. Like, this is what I'm going to do to sort of deal with this issue. Yep.
So that's the first piece of this. The second piece really gets at the severe or pervasive piece. It says, notwithstanding any court precedent to the contrary, conduct doesn't need to be severe or pervasive to constitute harassment. And instead, it says, this is how we want courts to look at what's harassment. So if you turn to page 2, it says, determination shall be made on the basis of the record of as a whole, according to the totality of the circumstances, and a single incident might constitute harassment. So what this allows, basically says to the courts, is look at the whole picture, not just events in isolation, and also consider that if you have a single serious event, that by itself could be harassment under the statute. You don't have to have a series of events stretching out over months at a time or something like that. And then the next piece is incidents shall be considered in the aggregate with varying types of conduct or conduct based on multiple characteristics viewed in totality rather than isolation. The example I always give with this is someone who's targeted because of their national origin, their race, and their religion at different times. Instead of saying, we're going to look at your race, your national origin, and your religion separately, we're looking at that as 3 different manifestations of the same harassment. And then we're determining if it was unlawful harassment based on that conduct as a whole. And then the third is saying conduct can constitute unlawful harassment regardless of the following. So the first is the complaining student is the person being harassed. So what this contemplates is if the student is present when someone who shares that characteristic is being targeted for harassment, but it's not the student themselves. So say you have a Jewish student who's present when another student is the subject of anti-Semitic slurs. They could feel harassed in that situation and threatened by that conduct. The next is the complaining student acquiesced or otherwise submitted to or participated in the conduct. So this would be hazing or something like that, where the student is afraid to stand out and they go along with the conduct, even though it's personally damaging. The third is the conduct is experienced by others outside of the protected class involved in the conduct. So maybe you have conduct that's broadly discriminatory, but they happen to be one of several people who experiences it. Or you have conduct where the jokes are made and you have people from various different protected classes present. That particular student, because of the way the conduct affected them and based on their protected class, feels harassed, even though there might have been a diverse group present for the conduct. The complaining student was able to continue the student's education or access to school resources. This gets back to educational performance. The student was able to continue accessing the school's resources, even though they were the subject of harassment. The conduct resulted in physical or psychological injury. Again, this goes back to a really old theory in law that at one point you needed to show that you suffered, in some jurisdictions, that you suffered some sort of physical or psychological or emotional harm as a result of tortious conduct. Conduct that was targeting you. And so this is saying you don't need to go back to that old-fashioned piece here where you'd have to show that you developed an ulcer or you developed a psychological or emotional condition or something like that in order to prove that you were discriminated against. And I want to just touch on the use of the term psychological here. I know Senator Hashim last week brought this up during testimony. An emotional injury would be an appropriate term. It's more commonly used in the Vermont statutes. We went with psychological here because that was what was used when we updated the fair housing laws last year. So it's keeping it consistent with the language that's in S103 and the language that passed last year. if you did want to go with emotional injury, we could do that in concert with a change in 103, but I'd be concerned about going with two separate terms, just because of questions that might arise about whether we intended something different in the educational realm rather than the employment and public accommodations realm.
I mean, if the effect is the same thing, then I would, there's any point in changing it.
I read the effect as being the same, but I think emotional injury is more commonly used. But when we drafted this, we were looking at a different state's law as a model. So, and then the conduct occurred outside the complaining student's school. So this really gets at things like harassment that spreads to social media, or harassment that may be occurring at school, but it's also occurring at sporting events outside of school or other community events. And so the harassment, which has got its nexus at school, has spread to these areas outside of school, but the focus is still related to what's happening at school. So if you turn to page 3 now, so we've kind of set out the guidelines for how to find this. And we've said it doesn't need to be severe or pervasive. By the same token, conduct that a reasonable person with the same protected characteristic would consider to be a petty slight or a trivial inconvenience would not constitute harassment. So what are we getting at here? What we're looking at is, was it someone being short-tempered rather than discriminatory? Was it a bad grade on a quiz that is not part of a targeted pattern of grading someone down based on their characteristics? So, and I may not be giving the best examples here, but we're looking at things that would be considered a petty slight that would be normal in being at school, and a reasonable person with the same characteristic wouldn't find it to be discriminatory. So you can't have, you can't just simply say, I have this protected characteristic, I have this event that I didn't like. If a reasonable person wouldn't also find it to be discriminatory conduct, the court can draw the line there and say that that doesn't meet the standard.
Did any examples come up in prior testimony that you can think of, or just drawn now?
Off the top of my head, I'm drawing some blanks here. I'm sure that your other witnesses here, based on their practice in this area, could provide you with better examples than I can. So the next section here would amend 16 VSA 570F, and this gets to what happens when the school's internal process of addressing harassment, when you reach the end of that harassment or that process and the individual is not satisfied with the outcome, and then they're bringing a case under the Public Accommodations Act. So when you get to the end of that process, or if engaging in that process would be futile, so you, for example, the person engaging in the harassment is the person that you have to bring the complaint to. So you can show that that would be futile, then you have the option to bring a case under the Public Accommodations Act. And so under existing law, in order to do that, you would first have to show that the unwelcome conduct was based on the student or their family member's actual or perceived membership in a protected class. And then that the conduct was either pervasive or severe under existing law. And what this would do is strike that severe or pervasive requirement. And then I would otherwise leave that provision the same as it is currently. So the process would be the same, but your standard for showing that discrimination occurred would be the new standard where you're not required to show that it was severe or pervasive. The one other thing that's not in this amendment that would need to change is S-103 left the Senate with a provision in it that specifically says the new definition of harassment for the Fair Housing and Public Accommodations Act would not apply to lawsuits brought under this section.
Might be S-103.
That's the anti-discrimination bill that Loud,
Okay. Yes.
your colleagues' committee next door. So if you decide to put this in the miscellaneous education bill, I would encourage you to reach out to House General that has 103 right now and ask them to just strike that exclusion, because otherwise you're going to end up with a strange dichotomy where you have the Fair Housing and Public Accommodations Act saying the identical definition of harassment doesn't apply to education, even though you've updated the definition of harassment in education. So, and this is where we get into just the instances where we have to make sure if it's going in two separate bills, that the bills are going to mesh together cleanly in terms of terminology and any sort of carve outs. Great. Any questions?
So for the slow student in the room, I'm just kind of catching up. So this is an amendment to the House Education Miscellaneous Bill, right? Okay. So if I can just ask a couple questions. So I
I should
noticed,
just preface, sorry, by saying, if that's what the committee wants to do, it seems like Ms. Yang and Ms. Garces, you'd like this to move this year. Why wait? That's a vehicle. If we start a different bill, it wouldn't make all the way through the process.
thanks, a little clearer now. Okay, so in this bill, as in many bills, I see a lot of reference to race, creed, color, national origin, marital status, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability. You seem to be constantly recently dropping out religion. And I'm not a very religious guy, so don't take this from the wrong perspective. But we've had instances in our country's memory, or global memory, of global genocide based on religion. Is there any notion of, as this was developed, of why religion is not one of these kind of harassment scenarios?
This uses creed as an old-fashioned term for religion. And so religious discrimination is covered under creed here. This is actually something we were discussing in the House.
But it is clearly spelled out another harassment
And it
legislation.
depends on the timing for when they were adopted and what the language was. So we actually see it phrased three different ways. We see it phrased as creed, we see it phrased as religious creed, and then we see it phrased in the newest phrasing as religion. And so creed is an older Western term, primarily out of the Christian tradition, for the different denominations of religion. So the newer terminology would be, and the better terminology probably would be religion. And they were actually discussing in House General last week about whether they want to include just a changeover to religion across the board so that there's consistency, instead of saying, and they were coming across it where our Public Accommodations Act says creed and our Fair Housing Act says religious creed. And so they were saying, well, is there a difference, or should we just say religion so that it's clear that we mean the same thing? Because it's side by side within a paragraph of each other. So in here, religious discrimination would be covered under creed, but that's something you could consider as really a technical amendment, to my mind, just to update the terminology.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Please, couple.
Yeah.
Okay.
That was a very good point.
Is the intent, and I know you're not an intent guy, but you've heard the other deliberations. This is targeted harassment from student to student, teacher to student.
So this targets harassment of a student. So
So all the above.
as I understand it, it could include harassment by a staff member or a fellow student. And then the other bill, 103, it covers harassment of employees. And so there you have the workplace. The employer has a duty to keep the workplace free from discrimination, and this deals with the school's duty to keep the educational learning environment free from this kind of harassment. So.
Please, no, this is good.
Okay, so certainly it seems to lower the press of what harassment is fairly clear. It just seems that, like, and I think actually in your verbal explanation, it highlights that even like one act can constitute harassment.
And that could happen under existing law.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's worth noting on page 2, that list under little Roman numeral 3 there. So from lines 9 through 19, all of those, the regardless of whether list, that's all actually taken from existing case law. So what Vermont would be saying here is that we agree with the precedents in these cases here, because what's happened over time is that because judges are human, what you have is the precedent diverges a little bit over time. And so some cases will say the complaining student must be the person being harassed, and that others will say it's regardless of whether they're harassed. And so you get some confusion in the precedent, and this is basically the state saying we're going to follow these precedents going forward. And so that's what this is doing. You were specifically asking about something though. Could you remind me? Because I lost track of.
One act.
So the one act there, so under existing law, one act could be sufficiently severe by itself to constitute unlawful harassment.
We remove the words severe.
Right, so under existing law, one act could already do it if it met the sufficiently severe standard. And then under this, you'd remove the severe standard, but one discriminatory act would still meet the unlawful discrimination standard. So what you get out of, what changes here is that with that one act, you're not asking, was it sufficiently severe to constitute unlawful discrimination? And then you have to look at where the severe standard's been set in prior cases. You just have to ask, was that a discriminatory act? And it's a policy question for you about whether you want to set where you want to set the bar on these cases. But that's what would change. So with sexual harassment, which is something that I deal with more frequently in the employment law sector, unwelcome groping of someone's sexual body parts would clearly be a single act, whereas in the past you've had inappropriate comments where that's had to meet a pervasive standard rather than a severe standard. And so you'll see this dichotomy where the courts say, well, this is clearly severe enough, but that I need to see repeated instances before I'm going to see that, even though the court might say, clearly this was inappropriate, but it wasn't sufficiently pervasive to be actionable. And so that's what the removing the severe pervasive standard would do, is it would allow courts to find that something violated the law, even if it wasn't either pervasive or severe.
You keep mentioning the court, so if there are two students that are having students harassing another student, I'm assuming in those situations, correct me if I'm wrong, it depends on what's on the book in that supervisory union as to how it's handled.
Right, so just like in employment law, the schools have a policy against harassment, the same way an employer would have a policy against discrimination and sexual harassment. And so the first and ideally the best line or place for these issues to be dealt with is in the workplace or in the school, where the school sets clear standards, they enforce their rules fairly, they enforce them promptly, they do thorough investigations, and they enforce things in an even-handed manner. What the law basically provides is, first, it says this is the standard that you need to enforce. And then second, it says if you don't enforce this standard, then there's this backstop where you can go to the Human Rights Commission, you can file a claim in court, et cetera. So, and that's the same thing in employment. So here at the State House, for example, we have policies against sexual harassment in the House and Senate. And both of those policies set a standard that is below severe or pervasive, with the idea being that any sort of sexual harassment will get addressed before it rises to the level of being unlawful. And so different employers set their standards and write their policies differently, and that's a decision that the General Assembly has made to establish a working environment that's free from that kind of harassment. And it's sort of a preemptive approach. With this change in the law, that would become the legal standard there, is that any sort of harassment would be unlawful, and it would. So right now for schools, they have to enforce at least a severe or pervasive standard. And the concern that first came up last biennium when this was first considered, there was no proposed change to Title 16. And so schools said, wait, you're asking us to adopt policies with a severe or pervasive standard, but then you'd be letting us be sued under a law that doesn't have that standard. There's clearly a disconnect. This proposes to address that disconnect by eliminating the severe pervasive standard for schools too. Again, this is obviously a policy decision for you to decide whether that's the appropriate way to proceed. But the enforcement is always in the first instance at the school or at the workplace. And then it's only if that fails that you then find yourself in front of the Human Rights Commission or in courts.
So in taking the language of the amendment, the determining if whether something is a petty slight or trivial inconvenience, is that first adjudicated at the school level or at the classroom level? I mean, to go up to the Human Rights Commission and for, I mean, it just seems, the bar is really low, and it's
so
difficult to draw a line here.
Right. So this would be something that first the schools would be called on to determine if something rose above that level or didn't. And then there would certainly be, I imagine, just like there are right now with the severe pervasive standard, there will be instances where a student disagrees with the school on whether something past that level of being a petty slight or trivial inconvenience or being actual discrimination. And then you'll see that case potentially go up in a set basically a standard that provides guidance in future cases. So what happens now for an employment lawyer like myself, or for an HR director, or for whoever handles disciplinary matters at a school, is they're going to talk presumably with counsel and say, this is the fact pattern I've got. To me, it's a close call. What does the precedent say on this? And that's where they'll look at the prior decision and say, well, in 2024, the Human Rights Commission had a case on this, and this is how their ruling came out, and applying that ruling to this case, I think it's clear that this was a petty slight, or it's clear that this is probably exceeds that bar because this is very similar to that case. And so that it's going to develop the same way the severe pervasive standard has developed over the last 37 years or so that it's been around. And, you know, the question is, you know, each time you get one of these cases, you say, does this rise to the level of being discrimination? Is there a protected class? Was the behavior discriminatory? Was it adverse behavior based on that protected class? And then if you're looking at, is there legal liability? Was it severe or pervasive? And so these are all things that you already asked. You're just going to be asking it at this different level of, was it clearly discriminatory, or was it so small as to just be a petty slight or a trivial inconvenience for the individual affected? So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer for you, but it's it wouldn't change the way we approach this, except that it would change that standard to a different standard.
Are we required, or is it in the bill where we have to provide training? Is it going to be a policy like AOE?
So my understanding, and this is where hearing from my colleague Beth St. James would be better. My understanding is that right now schools are required to have a policy on harassment. So they would need to update their policies to reflect any change in the law. I can't speak for the schools on what sort of burden that might be. Or whether they might need more time to do this and to get trained. Those are all questions that you would need to direct to the school boards and the principals, et cetera.
It's a great question.
And so that's something where, as far as training, can't really speak to that. Right now, the employment bill is scheduled to take effect July 1, 2023. But there are always questions about transitioning and allowing time for policies to be updated. So that's a valid, if you decide to move forward with this policy, question of whether you want to push out the effective date or something like that is always a valid policy question. I can't speak for either side as to the timing to implement.
Thank you. I'm generally in favor of this. I do have a few thoughts that I wanted to share. One being that I am a little concerned that this is going to have end up having like a very potentially punitive effect, especially for school districts that don't have a robust restorative justice or restorative program in place. I'm concerned about the prison to school to prison pipeline. Where I live, a lot of kids who would be part of these protected classes take a lot of their cues from social media on how to behave and how to interact with peers, and that's not always a good thing. So I absolutely 100% want to protect students from harm. I also very much know that kids' frontal lobes are not fully developed and they make lots of mistakes. And sadly, many are now taking cues from sources that are not necessarily productive or positive. So I guess that's my reservation. I think a school that has a robust restorative process or culture, this is probably wonderful. But if it doesn't, if the resources are already stressed in that regard, I guess I'm worried that this could not be positive for all our kids.
Yeah. It's suspended. The kid, somebody was on TikTok, sitting home for a couple of days, you get behind your work, you can see where things snowball. All right, so we can hear from some witnesses on this. Yes, Naresh.
I don't know if this question is a bit of a reach, but so I'm looking at severe, pervasive, and harassment, and then I'm my mind then goes to intentional infliction of emotional distress. So is it standard that the one instance of harassment, if it is one instance, does it have to be extreme and outrageous? Similar to what's expected, similar to the same standard under intentional infliction of emotional distress, or how is that determined?
So it is not the same intentional standard as intentional infliction of emotional distress. There's extensive case law right now on what constitutes severe or pervasive harassment, and I'm trying to think of off the top of my head. Of course, I'm not thinking of cases to give you a good example, but the case law provides a lot of guidance on sort of where the severe conduct falls, but I think it's not quite the same as the extreme and outrageous conduct that you would need for intentional infliction of emotional distress. And a lot of it looks at sort of the particular conduct, the context of it, etc. And so when you're looking at it, it's a little bit different standard overall. So it's not quite the same as the actionable intentional torts.
Yeah. So if it need not be severe and pervasive, and isolated by itself, the definition or the threshold for harassment, what is that threshold that if it's not severe and pervasive? And you may have already explained this.
So the examples here could include things like racial slurs, jokes made about someone based on their gender or gender identity, notes, pictures. It could include various derogatory comments. It could include adverse actions that are taken based on someone's characteristic. And so, I mean, one of the important things to keep in mind is because of the variety of characteristics that are protected, the conduct that we're talking about could vary greatly. So sexual harassment can include things like derogatory comments or jokes based on someone's gender. It doesn't have to be like sexually propositioning someone.
So is it basically, we'll know it when we see it? Is that?
So the question is it discriminatory? And rather than asking, is this pervasive discriminatory conduct, we're asking, is it discriminatory conduct? So that I think is the key. So it's not a we'll know it when we'll see it. Is it discriminatory conduct, period? Not is this severely discriminatory or pervasive discriminatory
I
conduct?
clears it up. Thank you.
Yeah.
Would this law would this be applicable to all schools in Vermont, so private schools and recognized schools, et cetera, et cetera?
I would have to ask Beth
Okay.
on that. So that's a good question. I don't know exactly the extent of the school harassment law here. So I would either defer to Bohr, who receives these claims, or to Beth, who has much more knowledge about the extent of the education law.
What about grades? This pre-K through 12?
It applies to all the students who are subject to these harassment requirements, which I think is pre-K through 12, but I would need to double check with Beth again on that.
Yeah, so I agree with the comments here about protecting students from harm, and I understand the intent of the bill. I certainly support creating clean learning environments. But my caution is that we're potentially creating a scenario of just hypersensitivity, where, one instance of perceived harassment they become like, de facto severe and pervasive with different language there. It's harassment. So I'm just a little still uncomfortable with the intended environment we're trying to create and in fact, creating an environment which becomes hypersensitive, which creates an entirely new problem. That's my.
I share the concern. I'm just trying to put myself on the other end of it also, where it's, if you're a student of color, somebody, calls you something horrific, what that does to that student, what we're trying to do, I think, is that would elevate it to have that conversation. You're not going to court, no matter what, you're not going to court. Somebody uses, God forbid, the N-word, you're not going to court because of it. You're going to, the school is dealing with it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, the first step in all of these is through the school.
Right.
So
Think about
the
being
school
that
has to
student,
have,
on the receiving end of that. School's gonna deal with it. If the school ignores it, and it's elevated.
right. So the schools are already required to have a policy and a procedure in place for dealing with it. The big change under this is the standard for what is actionable is changing. So this would, so rather than schools being liable only if they failed to deal with something that was severe or pervasive harassment based on one of these protected characteristics, they could be liable if they failed to deal with something that was harassment based on one of these characteristics, provided it exceeded that petty slight or trivial inconvenience language. And so I am not super familiar with the process for how schools deal with this. And so that's something where if you need to know more about that process and what these cases look like, I suggest hearing from the Human Rights Commission and from practitioners who work in that environment. I can't really speak to the current school policies and what an investigation of an allegation at a school looks like right now and how that process will carry out.
But just go back to what Senator Weeks said about, prevention. How are we gonna, a lot of people don't know that this law will even exist. So, a lot of children learn from home. So how are we gonna educate? Right. How are we gonna educate them unless it's a required subject that everybody has to go through?
Yes, and you raised that also earlier around, do we give people time to get something like this? Is there training so that students, faculty, and staff are all up? And then the question around the independent school, and then the questions also around, is this a K through 12 standard policy or all things?
If you do it and you know what you're doing is wrong, that's different than doing it and not knowing it's wrong.
And I just want to say, I just feel strange. I just want to acknowledge that I used even this expression I used, the N-word, just seems like such a strange, just didn't set with me after I said it to just wanted to say that for correction. Anything else, please?
My last comment is just that I am worried this is going to unintentionally harm new American kids in my district.
Unintentional, yeah.
Unintentionally.
I think that's why the national origin issue is there. It's intended to protect.
I know, but I'm worried it's going to be opposite.
How,
I mean, I already stated that I just feel as though they're navigating a new world a lot of times, and they are taking cues from areas that I mentioned, social media, for example, and that if we don't give them the opportunity to learn in a restorative environment, I'm concerned that this could snowball.
Thank you, Mr. Leonard. Why don't we take just 5 minutes and we'll hear from Ms.